Hey, Joe Zarzaur here with Dr. Evan Malone. We are talking generally in these videos about wrongful death cases. Again, wrongful death cases are personal injury cases where the person not only has an injury but succumbs to those injuries and dies. And then the family is looking to figure out who they can go after for the carelessness or recklessness in causing the death. The topic we're going to talk about specifically today is the private autopsy. And this is a phrase that I was not familiar with until I started working in wrongful death cases 20 plus years ago. But the private autopsy is an autopsy that you as a family pays for and gets, or if you are seeing a lawyer about the wrongful death case, the law firm many times, like we do, hires out a special forensic pathologist to conduct the autopsy and pays for that autopsy out of pocket. The private autopsy is an autopsy that is completely done outside of the hospital care, okay? So what that means is most of the time, these are done in medical malpractice cases. Not all the time, but most of the time these are done in medical malpractice cases. And the reason they are done is, for whatever reason, the medical examiner either didn't do an autopsy, didn't think it was necessary. We've talked about that in other videos, Dr. Malone, about when it's necessary. And but for whatever reason, the medical examiner didn't do the autopsy. Or the hospital did what's called a hospital autopsy, which we've talked about in another video also. And the hospital autopsy is very, it's more of a gross examination of the conditions. It's not a detailed examination. And the goal of the hospital autopsy is really nothing more than to put findings on paper, not to come to any conclusions. So the private autopsy, alternatively, is detailed and is targeted to find out exactly what happened to your loved one and exactly why they passed away from a scientific standpoint. And it's meant to preserve all of the evidence we need to make sure that we're able to prove that later on. So, Dr. Malone, tell everybody you've been to these private autopsies for the firm. Tell us what they are and why and then I'll touch on why it's important to have in a more wrongful death case. But tell us what is involved in the private autopsy.
Sure. So let's back up for just a second. So in this setting, the medical examiner has not done an autopsy for whatever reason, as you had alluded to, because the examiner's office knows the manner and knows the cause of death, okay? So based on whatever other information they have, so that they're not doing an autopsy. And then there's a need that the family wants for an autopsy. The funeral home will have the body at this point typically because it's been released by the medical examiner's office. And so then it's in the custody of a private funeral home. And the family then has, I guess, jurisdiction, for lack of a better word, on what's the next step. Are we going to cremate? Are we burying? Or do we want an autopsy for whatever reason?
And it's really, and I'm going to interrupt, but it's really important if you don't have a lawyer involved at that point and you're thinking about getting one, that this is the time to get a lawyer involved, because the funeral home can do things to the body that make it harder to gain information from. And you do not want to get the funeral home down the road a bit doing the embalming process, for instance, or doing other things to the body that create more of a problem for the private forensic pathologist. So, Sorry to interrupt.
No, yeah, and so one example would be someone who is in a medical facility. There are different invasive lines that are in place, breathing tubes, IV devices, things like that, that a medical examiner or a private autopsy would want to see how those come with, for their exam of the body. So, as Joe mentioned, you got to make that call soon to say, do you think an autopsy would be something that would be helpful for either we may have a case or our family wants some answers. So at the autopsy, the private autopsy company will arrange for transport of the body to wherever their facility is. Sometimes you have to go counties away to get a qualified pathologist who you're comfortable working with, where you're going to get good communication and good feedback from them.
Who is also not biased and not going to be swayed by the fact that there's a local hospital involved potentially or a local physician involved. So it's actually healthier for your case to be a little bit more removed physically, geographically rather, from the area where the case could be pending, because you don't want that forensic pathologist, which is a board certification, right, in the medical profession, to be swayed by any allegiance they may have or biases they may have in favor of an institution, like a hospital or a physician.
Yeah, or a private individual, if a wrongful death situation where they may know the individual or know social circles. So anyhow, at the facility then, when the autopsy is undertaken, there's a lot that goes on before knives and scalpels and all that are even brought out. So everything is documented from the get-go, the whole chain of custody, the identity of the deceased, permission, things like that. And there's photographs, like thousands of photographs that are taken, not even of the body, but of how the body arrived to them. So that documents everything, as Joe mentioned, as far as evidentiary needs. Once the autopsy is underway, the pathologist is leading and mostly doing everything. There are technicians or assistants who are in the room collecting different fluid samples for toxicology needs, labeling everything correctly, double checking everything for the labeling. And then the ones that I've seen, the pathologist, is, for lack of a better word, they're scrubbed in, so they are gloved up, everything in protective material, and they're actually writing on a dry erase board with a marker that they're probably going to throw away afterwards because it's one-time use. They write all their notes, take a picture of the board, that's their notes, which ultimately gets translated into, I guess, a dictated or a prose version of what their findings. That's just the gross part with what they've seen, and I use gross not as this is disgusting, gross in that this is what they see with the naked eye. And then there's microscopic samples of every organ that is pertinent to the case or to the matter that will be sent off to a lab to be put onto slides for the pathologist then to follow up on and then couple that information with their gross findings. And then any toxicology that may have been pertinent, fluid, either blood, urine, or vitreous, the gel inside your eye, those are sent out to a lab, and those are the ones you always hear on the news. It's 12 weeks until we get toxicology back or whatever. So then that will come back, and then as the third, leg of the stool that the pathologist then will, compose their entire report on. These are my findings, and if you're asking me for a cause or a manner of death, this is my support for it.
Now, why this matters to your wrongful death case or your family's wrongful death case is important to understand too. I said that many times these come up in the context of a medical malpractice case where you're suing a doctor or a hospital or a nurse for causing the death. Well, one of the best ways to defend those cases is to say that the death wasn't actually caused by the malpractice. It was actually caused by the original reason they were in the hospital in the first place, which is some kind of disease process they had going on, or something happened suddenly in the hospital, like a heart attack that would have happened no matter what. That is what they do to defend these cases. And we've talked about in other videos how hard it is to win medical malpractice cases to start with. If you don't have good, clear causation evidence of the reason the person passed away in the form of an autopsy, you run the risk of losing the case after proving that there was a medical mistake. Because you can have a medical mistake that's proven but more likely than not, right? And then you're not able to prove that the medical mistake actually caused the death because your autopsy evidence or your cause of death evidence is not significant enough to get you over the more likely than not standard. So that's why it's so important to have a really good autopsy done if you have a wrongful death case, especially if it's a medical malpractice case or a potential medical malpractice case. If you have questions about the private autopsy, they usually run between $7,000 and $10,000 a piece. That doesn't include all the backup, the transportation, and that doesn't include all the payments you have to make to the expert after the autopsy to get the consultations, to get the testimony, to preserve evidence, to get further testing of organs if they're preserved. So this is something that is evidence, remember. And I know it's almost inhumane to talk like this, that the body is evidence. The body is evidence, and the organs become evidence. And you have to do certain things in the legal world to make sure you secure the evidence properly so that if they become something that the other side's going to disagree about, they not only have the option to review the evidence, but they have the option to do their own testing on the evidence that's been preserved. So if you have questions about wrongful death cases...
Let me add one thing. And afterwards, if your family's wishes or that of the deceased is for cremation, that can proceed as planned or desired after the autopsy process is complete.
But if you know who your defendants are before you approve the crematorium process, you have to also give notice to the defendants, the potential defendants, that you're going to do this, and then they have the right to do their own autopsy, join your autopsy. You cannot destroy evidence, as with any case, until you've given if you know the prospective defendants, you have to give them the ability to look at the evidence too. So that could also cause you legal problems. So if you have questions about any wrongful death matter, the private autopsy process, referrals to private forensic pathologists, we have several that we choose from. You can find us on the web at zarzaurlaw.com, or you can call us at 855-HIRE-JOE.